It's day 2 of Brighton Fringe starting today, and I've actually got some distance between myself and my home city. I'm up at Riverside Studios in London, in a nice cafe with a view over the river. You may or may not, yeah, you can see that a bit. Having just had a morning walk, I'm getting reflective. And what I thought I would do, which I think might be useful for theatre makers and theatre goers, and people just interested in Fringe, is to do a very selective comparison of Brighton Fringe and Edinburgh Fringe. And the things that I'm comparing just sort of come into my head as I speak, although I have thought of a few of these in advance. So what's the difference between Brighton Fringe, which is England's largest arts festival? So it likes to be proud of how big it is, not how small it is. And some fringes do like to be proud about how small and manageable and human scale they are, such as Barnstable Fringe or Durham Fringe would just be 2 examples. There are many more. And Edinburgh, which calls itself, probably is the world's largest arts festival. So one comparison is one is bigger than the other, but both are pretty big. Comparing Edinburgh Fringe, which still goes for growth, whatever it says, is kind of 3,500 shows or more. And Brighton Fringe, I think, peaked around getting towards 1,000. It was probably over 800, and these now I think over 700 this year. Edinburgh Fringe is still talking very loudly about how it was almost ruined in COVID and how it's still in recovery, and Brighton Fringe does the same as well. Edinburgh Fringe is in Scotland, Brighton Fringe is in England. Edinburgh Fringe has extremely expensive accommodation, unaffordable for many people, and Brighton is getting there and still has very, very expensive accommodation during the Fringe. Edinburgh offsets that in some ways by having quite a scaled up amount of student accommodation, which can make things affordable for people in the centre and outside the city. Brighton doesn't, and as far as I know, it's quite hard to get accommodation, student accommodation during May. Though there are some soundings about hostel accommodation coming at some point soon, it's also very expensive and quite hard to get accommodation. Edinburgh is a city in its own right, and its nearest cities are things like Glasgow and Newcastle, and so you can come in on a day trip just about from Newcastle quite easily from Glasgow, and so you can stay in Glasgow, which might well be cheaper. Whereas Brighton, its nearest city, big city, is London, and people do come down, but trains are getting more and more expensive, particularly if you come down for a whole day during the week. Edinburgh has shows that are on all month. Brighton has shows that are on for a couple of days, and some come at the beginning and some come at the end, which is also happening with some shows in Edinburgh too. Might be to make it more affordable, but if you get a review at the beginning of the Fringe in Brighton and come back in the last week, that review can actually have an impact as well. Brighton, so let's start with Edinburgh. Edinburgh has a printed programme with kind of genres like cabaret and live literature and theatre and of course comedy, and comedy is by far the largest section in the Edinburgh Fringe programme. Brighton is the same. It's back this year with a printed programme and looks pretty much as it always did, a bit like the Edinburgh Fringe brochure as well. So that's got very, very high amount of comedy and some theatre, a few pages, but not vast amounts, and it kind of seems to me to mirror the rise of comedy that continues across the arts, essentially. Edinburgh does not copy Brighton. I really don't think it does. Brighton does copy Edinburgh. Edinburgh is an international festival with a lot of shows from all over the world, although that again struggled after COVID, and with sustainability priorities on the planet, it's not so vital or easy to fly necessarily if you're on that sustainability priority. Brighton is a little bit international. There have been attempts in Brighton to pair up with the Netherlands and with, I can't remember what country on the African continent, and that's dependent on funding. Brighton is much less than Edinburgh. Brighton is known as a creative city, known as a vital creative hub in some ways. It's got a lot of creative businesses, filmmakers. It's sometimes known as a creative capital. Edinburgh has probably got some of that too, but it's not what it's known for. So my experience has been it's easier to find experimental stuff in the Brighton Fringe, and that spirit of sometimes lower budget, human scale experimentation. It's just harder to do that in Edinburgh because of the costs as well. Edinburgh has its own huge venues and hubs, and they're almost independent from the Fringe now, and you might have heard of Assembly and Underbelly. They used to be the big four, now they're the big seven. Brighton is almost desperate to have its own hubs, and I think that's part of copying Edinburgh and wanting some sort of national or international credibility. So this year we've got the Spiegel Garden, not the Spiegel Tent this year, which was only to do with the Valley Gardens area of Brighton being full of roadworks and won't be back necessarily for a couple of years. But it has a big hub called the Spiegel Garden, and that's about drinking, and that's about going to see cabaret and comedy. But it doesn't have venue after venue after venue like a venue like Underbelly or Assembly does up in Edinburgh. There is a small circus hub which has just appeared also on the Level in Brighton. So it's that small scale compared to Edinburgh, which almost has a fringe on that fringe, which is all the smaller venues on the fringe of these massive venues doing mainstream shows. There is one in Brighton called Rotunda that feels a bit to me like a little hub compared to the bigger hubs. There are big posters all on the fences that go round, and a lot of those shows will play places like Edinburgh. I almost see Brighton as a place to come through or to almost preview before they go to other venues before they arrive at Edinburgh. So Edinburgh is huge scale, Brighton is kind of much smaller but still big scale compared to lots and lots of other fringes too. Edinburgh does have a seaside, but it's not really located that near. You have to get a bus all the way down there, but it does have stuff happening on the seafront. Brighton didn't for quite a while, even though it's got a big seafront. The Fringe didn't seem to be part of it, but there is a couple of venues, one by the Brighton Zip Wire, and I can't remember the name of it, it's Dalston's or Dalton, I can't remember, but anyway there's one venue, but there's not loads of stuff happening as part of Brighton Fringe on its seafront, which I find rather bizarre myself. You can get deep fried Mars bar in Edinburgh, it's much harder to find in Brighton. Brighton is 50 minutes from the UK capital, London. Edinburgh is its own capital city, its own large city. Just a couple of other things I'd probably mention, which is Edinburgh attracts a lot but declining amount of kind of international and national press coverage. You can get reviews in The Guardian, you'll get more local coverage down in Brighton, and therefore social media and local newspapers and so on, of which there are hardly any, but those local reviews become more important. But quite often down in Brighton, if you're only playing 2 or 3 days compared to the whole month in Edinburgh, though as I said many shows in Edinburgh now are just playing a week or even coming in the last week, and we have literally hundreds of shows arriving in Edinburgh that aren't playing the whole month. Brighton is mostly a day, 2 days, 3 days, though I've noticed there are several shows playing the entire month as well, or at least playing a week or two as well. Edinburgh has 2 free Fringe festivals. Brighton has one, run by Laughing Horse Comedy, so it's attracted its own upstairs in pubs, pay on the way out approach as well. I guess Edinburgh is quite expensive to get to if you're coming from England into Edinburgh, and particularly down from London. Brighton has got more expensive, but it depends what train you get. In Brighton you can come down from London. If you come off peak on the Thameslink, that's a lot cheaper than if you come down from Victoria. Final thing I would say is Edinburgh is more corporate than Brighton, though Brighton still, in copying Edinburgh, tries to come across as a bit corporate on its website too. It's a brand, you know, and it's about ownership of that brand. And Brighton Fringe's rhetoric has been, you know, that it's run by the people of Brighton, the people that make the shows. Edinburgh says the same, but they've got booking systems and registration and sponsorship. Both of those, that's big, and it's big in pretty much every Fringe festival, so I think that's probably a similarity everywhere. The last thing I would say, and this is from the point of view of going to see shows, Edinburgh has so much choice you'll never get round it all. Brighton has quite a lot of choice, but because everything's not running the whole month, you've got probably having to look in, and you'll suddenly find there's not much happening on a Monday or a Tuesday. I know that's also a bit true in Edinburgh. There are still hundreds of shows in Edinburgh. That's not necessarily the case in Brighton, and those might be the days to go and see an open house, go and look at some art, for example. Last of all, I think what I would say from the point of view of do you go to both or do you go to either? For a lot of people, Edinburgh is quite hard to do a day trip and get round much, whereas in Brighton, even though it's very, very expensive, you might come on a day trip and be able to see 4 or 5 shows, and it'll feel smaller scale. It won't feel that there's something going on everywhere, and that allows the city itself to breathe around the Fringe, whereas in Edinburgh the Fringe kind of takes over everything and it's noisy and loud. There are queues to get into restaurants, whereas that might not be happening all week around Brighton. One similarity is the Edinburgh city has an international festival and several other festivals as well. Brighton has a Brighton festival too, that for me is also kind of has become a bit more grassrootsy, more local work, more affordable stuff too. So they sit alongside each other, and whereas Edinburgh Festival and Edinburgh Fringe seem very, very separate, Brighton Festival and Brighton Fringe, I think they've done at least one event in collaboration, that there's a sense of 2 different festivals as well that rub alongside each other, but do not overlap too much. So they're my main differences as I sit here at Riverside Studios in London having a cup of tea, 50 miles or so away from Brighton Fringe, which I'm going back to in a few days. I would say in lots of ways they're the same, but in many ways, not surprisingly, they're very, very different.